Welcome in. It is incredibly good to have you here with us today.
Absolutely. Great to be here.
If you are joining us, we custom tailor these deep dives just for you. We try to extract the absolute most important nuggets of knowledge from the sources you want to understand, without wasting your time on the basics.
Right, skipping the fluff.
Exactly. And today, we are looking at a truly pivotal moment in the digital asset space taking place right now in 2026.
It really is a fascinating time to be analyzing this space because the shifts we are seeing documented right now aren't just minor policy updates.
Yep.
They are structural. It's a foundational rewiring of how these networks actually operate.
Exactly. And the source material we have today provides a stark, really mechanical breakdown of how this is happening. It's an excerpt simply titled The Clarity Act Reality Check.
A very fitting title, honestly.
It is. And the mission for our deep dive today is to decode the specific jargon in this text and understand exactly how the 2026 regulatory framework is radically altering the DNA of liquid staking and digital assets as a whole.
Which, I mean, it's a heavy lift given the density of the language the author uses to describe these changes. But that is exactly why we are here, to synthesize the mechanics and the implications for you.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because for anyone trying to stay well-informed, whether you are actively managing tech infrastructure, prepping to analyze these markets for a high-stakes finance meeting, or you are just fiercely curious about how digital economies mature, this text is a goldmine.
It really is.
It essentially marks the exact moment an entire financial frontier was forced to grow up. And it does so by detailing the exact mechanisms of that maturation.
Forced to grow up is the perfect framing, because the text outlines a transition that creates an immense amount of friction for early adopters.
So massive friction.
Right, but the author argues it is absolutely necessary for the survival and integration of the entire ecosystem into broader capital markets.
So let's jump right into the first major dynamic the source outlines, because it sets the architectural stage for everything else. The text states that the 2026 regulatory framework has forced liquid staking providers to move from, quote, offshore shadows into strict compliance audits.
That's a huge leap.
It is. I really appreciate the stark contrast the author draws there.
Yeah.
If you think about it, it's kind of like a secret, unregulated speakeasy.
Oh, I like that.
Right, a speakeasy suddenly being mandated to operate with the compliance overhead of a federally audited bank.
Yeah.
But it goes so much deeper than just, turning on the fluorescent lights. Moving from offshore shadows to strict compliance audits fundamentally alters the tech stack and the legal liabilities of these providers.
It absolutely does. If we look at the mechanics of liquid staking providers before this 2026 regulatory framework operating in what the text rightfully calls those offshore shadows, you were dealing with an environment where anonymity and jurisdictional arbitrage were the primary features.
Right.
The protocol developers deliberately existed outside of traditional legal frameworks. And while that lack of oversight allowed for rapid, unconstrained deployment of capital, the text makes it clear that there was always an inherent systemic fragility to that model.
Because in those offshore shadows, there is no backstop.
Exactly.
There's no formalized recourse.
Yeah.
You say it alters the baseline risk profile, and the text emphasizes this point heavily. When an entity transitions into strict compliance audits, we aren't just talking about a quarterly spreadsheet review.
No, not at all.
The author implies a complete overhaul of how trust is established. The audit process forces these decentralized or semi-decentralized entities to legally bind themselves to the assets they're managing.
Precisely. And what the Clarity Act has done, according to our text, is drag these liquid staking operations into an environment where they must prove their structural integrity to third parties.
Yeah.
Now, why does this matter to you as a listener trying to grasp the current landscape? Because strict compliance audits fundamentally shift the nature of the risk you're taking on.
Right. The risk profile completely inverts.
Exactly. In the shadow era, your primary risk was existential. It was the risk of the entire protocol evaporating, or the anonymous founders disappearing with the treasury.
You were pricing in the possibility of a total, unrecoverable zero, which is a terrifying way to operate a global financial system.
Truly.
But with these strict compliance audits mandated by the Clarity Act, the text notes that third-party, legally recognized entities are now verifying that the assets are actually on-chain, that the smart contract code meets security standards, and that the corporate structure isn't a regulatory house of cards.
Exactly. And by imposing that structure, the risk shifts away from, will this provider completely disappear overnight, to how efficiently and legally are they managing their verified assets.
It sanitizes the environment.
It sanitizes it, and it introduces predictability. And as the author points out, predictability is the absolute core requirement for traditional institutional capital to feel comfortable participating at scale.
Right.
Institutions cannot allocate billions of dollars into a system where the primary risk is an anonymous developer losing a private key.
But you have to wonder about the friction this introduces. You say it sanitizes the environment, but doesn't the text also heavily imply this creates a massive barrier to entry?
Oh, definitely.
If a liquid staking provider now have to afford the overhead of a strict compliance audit, the days of the basement innovator launching a multi-million-dollar staking pool are effectively over.
They are.
The compliance costs alone act as a moat for the incumbents who can afford to play by these new 2026 rules.
That is the trade-off the text highlights. The maturation of the market comes at the cost of permissionless entry. By requiring strict compliance audits, the regulatory framework essentially mandates that only well-capitalized, highly organized entities can operate liquid staking infrastructure at scale.
So the offshore shadows were democratic, but dangerous.
Right. And the audited environment is exclusive but secure.
That predictability you mentioned, and the institutional capital it attracts, is exactly what triggers the next massive domino effect the author talks about.
Yeah, this is where it gets really technical.
Right, and this brings us to the most dramatic, analytical phrase in the document. The source highlights the, quote, death of the synthetic liquidity premium.
Such a strong phrase.
It is. But I admit, that sounds like incredibly heavy financial jargon. We all know how lucrative the synthetic liquidity premium was for early adopters leveraging yield-bearing tokens over the last few years. It was the primary driver of growth in this space. But the text argues this premium is now permanently dead under the new regulatory framework. Could you translate that for us?
Of course. What's fascinating here is how the text directly links the death of that premium to a very specific structural regulatory action. The document states this premium died because yield-bearing tokens are now legally classified under the new digital asset collateral standards. To really grasp why this classification is fatal to the premium, we have to dissect the financial mechanics of what that premium actually represented.
Let's dissect it, because the text makes a compelling case that standardizing these tokens kills the arbitrage that made them so profitable.
Right. Before the Clarity Act, you locked up your digital asset, you received a synthetic yield-bearing token in return, and the market allowed you to trade or leverage that token at a massive premium.
Yeah, the yields were crazy.
They were, but that premium wasn't just random market exuberance, it was a specific pricing mechanism.
It was hazard pay.
Exactly, it was hazard pay. The massive, sometimes wild profit margins you could generate by utilizing those synthetic tokens were a direct result of the offshore shadows we just discussed.
So the market was rewarding participants for taking on the extreme, unquantifiable risk of dealing with unverified, non-standardized digital assets.
Spot on. When you used a yield-bearing token as collateral in a decentralized market prior to 2026, the counterparty had no legal guarantee of what that token actually represented. Okay. Here's where it gets really interesting. So the wild profit, the synthetic liquidity premium, was essentially compensating you for the legal and structural opacity of the token itself.
Yes.
Because nobody actually knew what the legal reality of that synthetic receipt was in the event of a systemic failure. The yields had to be astronomical to attract liquidity.
Exactly. You were being compensated for operating in a legally undefined gray area. But look at what the source says happened under the 2026 framework. These yield-bearing tokens are now legally classified under new digital asset collateral standards.
They aren't mysterious anymore.
No, they aren't high-risk synthetic receipts. They are legally defined, explicitly categorized collateral, much like traditional financial instruments.
So what does this all mean for the broader market mechanics? If I'm an institutional trader and I now hold a yield-bearing token that the 2026 framework legally recognizes as standard collateral, my counterparty risk has plummeted
Dramatically.
The law now dictates how that asset is treated in the event of bankruptcy, liquidation, or transfer. It means cause and effect have taken over the pricing models. Because these yield-bearing tokens are now standardized, meaning every major institution and their legal department understands exactly what they are, how they are backed, and how they function under the law. The extreme, unquantifiable risk is gone.
And because that extreme risk is gone, the market no longer needs to pay you a massive premium to hold or utilize them.
Exactly. The wild speculative profit margins of synthetic liquidity have been completely priced out. The premium is dead because the hazard has been neutralized.
It is a brilliant, if somewhat sobering, realization of how regulation inherently strips away the Wild West profit margins of uncertainty.
It really does.
When things become safe, they become standardized. And when they become standardized, their yields compress to align with traditional risk-free rates. The outsized rewards were purely a symptom of a lack of clarity.
Right.
By officially classifying these tokens under digital asset collateral standards, the Clarity Act effectively turned a high-risk casino chip into a highly predictable, lower-yield financial instrument.
That is the ultimate, unavoidable trade-off of maturation in any financial market, and the text makes this abundantly clear. You trade the opportunity for astronomical, unexplainable gains for the guarantee that the floor won't completely fall out from under the ecosystem.
Right.
The sheer speculative excitement surrounding these tokens dies, but their foundational utility, their ability to be used as pristine collateral in global, regulated lending markets, skyrockets.
And that transition from a speculative casino to a global utility leads us directly into the final and perhaps most profound point from our source material.
The cultural shift.
Yes, this one is less about the strict financial mechanics of collateral and much more about a massive industry-wide cultural shift. The text states that we are completely transitioning from the era of move fast and break things to a strict institutional requirement for proof of solvency and validator transparency.
Move fast and break things. It is perhaps the single most famous defining mantra of the early tech era. And for a long time, it was the unofficial operating principle of the digital asset space. Oh, absolutely. It's the classic Silicon Valley ethos. Build the protocol in a week, push the code to mainnet, see where the vulnerabilities are, and patch them after the fact.
Yeah?
It's a philosophy that works incredibly well if you are building a consumer software product where the stakes are low. If a feature breaks in a social network, a user has to refresh their page. You move fast, you innovate rapidly, and the breakage is just considered the acceptable cost of iterative progress.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, you can immediately see why applying that exact same iterative ethos to global financial infrastructure was a recipe for catastrophe.
Right.
When you break things in the context of liquid staking or digital collateral, you aren't just causing a temporary service outage, you are evaporating capital. You are destroying systemic value and undermining the trust required for the network to function.
Which is exactly why the author argues that era is permanently over. The Clarity Act has officially killed the Silicon Valley hacker ethos in the digital asset space, replacing rapid iteration with rigorous verification.
And the source text points out exactly what structural pillars are replacing that old ethos. The text calls out two massive institutional requirements: proof of solvency and validator transparency.
These are game changers.
I want us to spend some real time exploring the mechanics of these two terms, because they are the ultimate reality checks for how liquid staking operates today. Let's tackle proof of solvency first, because the way the text frames it, this isn't just traditional accounting.
No, it is far more rigorous than traditional accounting. Let's look at the contrast. In the old era, the move fast and break things era, if you asked a platform to prove they had enough assets to cover user liabilities, you essentially had to rely on trust.
Right.
The provider would issue a PR statement, maybe publish a dashboard they controlled, or release an opaque attestation from a friendly third party. You just had to take their word for it, which, as we discussed earlier, was the core risk of the offshore shadows.
Right. It was an environment of trust, but you literally cannot verify.
Exactly.
But the Clarity Act's mandate for proof of solvency changes that paradigm from the ground up. The text indicates that proof of solvency under this new framework isn't a promise or a static document. It is a cryptographic certainty.
Yes.
It requires these liquid staking providers to mathematically prove to the public and to regulators that the total assets they hold on the network are strictly greater than the total liabilities they owe to their users at all times.
And they have to do this without revealing sensitive individual user data, which is where the cryptographic element becomes so vital. It's a real-time, mathematically undeniable proof of reserves.
Yeah.
It replaces the need for blind trust with the requirement for objective, verifiable data. You cannot fake cryptographic proof of solvency under these new institutional requirements.
Right.
If the math doesn't check out, the protocol is immediately flagged by the compliance auditors.
It fundamentally alters the relationship between the provider and the user. You don't have to hope they are solvent. You can verify the cryptographic proof yourself. But solvency is only half of the equation. which is why the text directly pairs it with the second institutional requirement, validator transparency. Because even if a protocol can cryptographically prove they have the assets, the network is only as secure as the entities actually processing the transactions.
Exactly. If proof of solvency is about mathematically proving you have the capital, validator transparency is about legally proving who is actually operating the machinery of the network.
Right.
In liquid staking, the entire system relies on validators, the node operators that are securing the network, proposing blocks, and earning the yield that eventually gets passed down to the token holders.
And in the offshore shadow days, the identity of those validators was largely irrelevant or deliberately obscured. A validator could be anyone. It could be an anonymous collective, it could be a massive servo farm subsidized by unknown geopolitical actors, or it could be a group of insiders with severe conflicts of interest manipulating the transaction ordering for their own benefit.
The author points out that under a strict institutional requirement for validator transparency, that anonymity is completely stripped away. Providers must now be transparent about who is operating the nodes.
This means KYC and AML.
Yes, know your customer and anti-money laundering standards apply directly to the infrastructure layer. They have to disclose uptime, geographic distribution of their servers, and crucially, they must disclose any conflicting financial interests that could compromise the integrity of the network's consensus mechanism.
It is the ultimate bright light turned on in the darkroom. You can't just deploy code and claim your system works anymore. The 2026 framework dictates that you have to cryptographically and legally prove you have the funds and that your validators are operating entirely in the clear.
Right.
But again, I have to look at the friction this causes. If you force validator transparency, do you risk centralizing the network? If only massive, legally compliant data centers can act as validators, doesn't that fundamentally alter the decentralized ethos these digital assets were built on?
That is the central tension the text highlights. The regulatory framework prioritizes institutional safety over absolute decentralization. By enforcing validator transparency, the Clarity Act acknowledges that while a fully anonymous decentralized network is resilient to certain types of attacks, it is highly vulnerable to financial manipulation and legal ambiguity.
Yes.
The framework sacrifices a degree of permissionless participation to ensure that the entity securing the network can be held legally accountable for their actions.
When you look at these two requirements locking together, the mathematical certainty of proof of solvency and the legal accountability of validator transparency, you see the complete architectural shift to the ecosystem.
You really do.
The 2026 framework hasn't just tweaked the rules around the edges. It has fundamentally redefined what it means to be a legitimate operational actor in the digital asset space.
It has forced the infrastructure to align with the standards of global finance, rather than operating as an isolated, experimental tech sandbox.
Okay, let's step back and summarize the core journey of what we've unpacked today, because the implications of this reality check are massive for the space.
They are.
The author makes a compelling case that the 2026 Clarity Act has essentially taken the entire liquid staking industry and forcefully migrated it from the unregulated, high-risk offshore shadows into the rigorous, highly structured world of strict compliance audits.
Right.
As a direct mechanical result of that transition, yield-bearing tokens are now legally classified as standard collateral. And because they are now safe, legal collateral, the hazard pay that drove the market, the wild, speculative synthetic liquidity premium, is officially dead.
Completely dead.
Finally, the reckless, iterative cultural era of move fast and break things has been completely eradicated, replaced by the heavy institutional demands of real-time cryptographic proof of solvency and absolute validator transparency.
This raises an important question, though. For you listening right now, why should you care about this specific regulatory shift? Why does analyzing the source text matter if you aren't personally running a liquid staking node or structuring a digital asset portfolio?
That is the crucial takeaway. Why does understanding this specific framework matter to our listener today?
It matters because whether you are actively working in tech, prepping for a finance meeting, or you are just fiercely curious about the evolution of the internet and finance, understanding the shift means understanding the new baseline for trust in the digital age.
The new baseline.
Yes.
Yeah.
The era of blind trust in charismatic protocol founders and flashy, self-reported dashboards is gone. The era of verifiable, cryptographic, and legal proof is here. The mechanisms outlined in this 2026 framework audits, collateral standardization, proof of solvency, don't just apply to liquid staking. They set the irrevocable precedent for how all digital decentralized systems will be forced to interact with the real world moving forward.
The frontier hasn't just been explored. It has finally been paved over. There are compliant speed limits now, there are regulatory stoplights, and there are audit highway patrols.
Yeah.
It is structurally safer, it is vastly more predictable, and because of that, it is finally ready to handle massive, sustained institutional traffic without the constant threat of systemic collapse.
It is the painful but necessary evolution from a speculative experiment into a foundational global economy.
Which leaves you, the listener, with one incredibly fascinating thing to chew on, something that builds entirely on the realities of this text.
What's that?
Now that the Clarity Act has mandated this strict validator transparency and this rigorous proof of solvency, turning the once shadowy world of liquid staking into a heavily audited, highly predictable institutional machine. Excuse me. Turning it into a machine, does this new sanitized safety net mean we will see traditional legacy banks completely take over the space? Will they utilize this newly classified legal collateral to dominate the market with their existing capital? Or will this strict, heavy compliance framework force the original digital pioneers to invent an entirely new, currently unimaginable technological way to bypass these systems, retreating further into the code to create the next generation of offshore shadows?
That is the billion-dollar question.
It's a structural tension we will have to keep a very close eye on. Thank you so much for joining us for this deep dive. Keep asking questions, keep looking for the reality checks behind the jargon, and keep exploring. We will catch you next time.